Hi there, welcome to my first quilt. I'm Sarah, and anybody that walks into my sewing room that isn't a sewer says, "Oh my goodness, how many pairs of scissors do you need?" Well, I think a lot. I think I need a lot of scissors and a lot of different styles of rulers and rotary cutters and all the cutting gadgets. And this episode is all about different types of cutting tools. Now, having the right tool for the job makes the job easier. So I'm kind of a collector of sewing gadgets. The first thing that you've got to have as a quilter, of course, is a rotary cutter. They come in all different styles. This is one of my very, very favorites from OmniGrip. And what I like about this is it's got a really good grip to it, and it also just pushes right down. I don't have to grasp the handle to reveal the blade. I simply push on it and the blade comes out, and it's got a nice cover so it's protected. Now, I have two little kids running around in my sewing area a lot, so I like that this also locks. There's a little locking switch right in the center, and then you can push on it and you don't have to worry about it cutting anything. So can't have my girls cutting their fingers and they can't cut any fabric that I don't want them to cut. This is also cool because it's got a heavy duty setting. And if you move this to the heavy duty setting, you can do really thick layers of materials, not just fabrics, all sorts of different things. Your blade's gonna come down even further, so you can cut through many thicknesses of batting, anything that you're cutting through that's really thick. Now, it's really easy to change the blades on your rotary cutters just by removing the screw, and that's pretty typical, but please be careful when you do that. They're very, very sharp, so you want to be super cautious when you're changing the blades in your rotary cutting tools, and then also make sure that you put the blades that are used back into the little plastic rotary cutting sheath before you put them in the trash, just to keep everything safe. So this is kind of like my go-to for cutting out quilts and basic cutting. Now, it's also really nice to have a smaller sized rotary cutter. This is a little tiny blade, and what this is handy for is cutting small things. So if you're doing applique and you're cutting around small objects or shapes, usually you use scissors, but sometimes if you're doing a little circle or a rounded edge, it's a little faster to use a rotary cutter than a pair of scissors. And having a smaller blade will allow you to make sharper turns. So it's another handy tool to have. This is a different style of a larger rotary cutter, and this is a really big blade. This is actually a 60mm blade, and this is great for cutting through long, big pieces of fabric. Now, you have to be a little bit more cautious with this style rotary cutter because to open it, you simply pull back on this little lever and the blade is exposed. So if I flip it over, you can see that the blade is completely exposed. And sometimes we have the tendency to set it down and walk away. You want to make sure that you close that again so that the sheath covers the blade, safety first. And finally, this is another style of rotary cutter. I like this too because of the way that it locks. Right now it's locked, so in order to reveal the blade on this one, you have to grasp the handle. It's locked so the blade won't come out. When I push this little button, it unlocks it, and now when I push on the handle, the blade comes out and I can cut. But every time you're cutting, you are pushing on that handle or grasping the handle at the same time that you're pushing on your fabric. So it's a little bit more strain on the hands, but it's still a really handy type of rotary cutter to use, and probably also the most common one that you'll see. But when you're not using it, not a bad idea to lock the blade and make sure you set it safely. Now, scissors. You've got to have a lot of pairs of scissors in a sewing room too. Not very often am I needing like a large pair of dressmaking shears. If you're cutting out garment patterns, you use the larger handle or the larger blade on a pair of scissors. You do want to make sure that you've got a good sharp pair of fabric scissors. Don't necessarily want everybody cutting boxes open and cutting into paper with your good fabric scissors. Maybe you even label them that they're yours and they're for fabric. I like to have a little smaller size of scissors handy. This is perfect for if I just need to cut a little bit of fabric, if I'm cutting out an applique piece. Usually if it's a lot of cutting, I'm going to use either my rotary cutter or a big pair, but it's nice to have this smaller pair if I need to cut a couple of threads off, or if I'm cutting off the dog ears on triangles, something like that. It's very handy. This pair here has a really short blade, but a very sharp tip. And I like these for rag quilts. You can easily get in and snip rag quilts. They also make a squeezy grip where when you squeeze the handles, it pinches and cuts. Those are good for rag quilts too. But sometimes it's nice to have this little shorter blade pair of scissors. It's also got a little curve on the inside edge of the blade, and that's for hooking threads if you need to. It makes it a little bit easier to cut. Next, I've got a couple of choices of applique scissors. Probably one of the most common pairs of applique scissors I use is a duck-billed applique. I like to do a lot of machine embroidered applique as well as quilting applique. And what's nice about this little duck bill is that it protects the base layer of fabric. So if you're cutting 2 layers of fabric, you're going to put this duck bill right along the base fabric, and then you can hold up the edge of the fabric to be trimmed, and it allows you to get in and just really cleanly cut and remove excess fabric. So a really nice pair of applique scissors. And again, when I'm working in the hoop for applique, I love these because they're really flat and it's really easy to cut away the excess applique fabric. For other types of applique where you're cutting out shapes, this is a really nice pair of serrated edge little tiny scissors. They've got a shorter blade which allow me to get into smaller pieces, and because they have a serrated edge, it really grips the edges of the fabric, or if I'm cutting through a fusible product for my applique, it grips the edges and gives me a really clean cut. They're very sharp all the way out to the point, because that's the worst when you're cutting and it's only cutting on the back edge of the blade and not the very tip. So these are really super sharp and they cut all the way to the very tip. And then it's a very fine point tip, so I can get into smaller areas. So if I'm cutting out a heart, I can easily get into the V at the top of the heart because these are so narrow at the tip. So a really handy pair of scissors to keep in hand. This is a pair of those little squeezy grip scissors. I like this pair because it's got a little sheath that covers the blade. I just pinch down on it and it comes out. And whenever you squeeze, these cut. So another handy pair of scissors for working on thread snipping. I like these for little snippings of threads. Finally, this is a surgical seam ripper. We've talked about fixing mistakes on the show and using different types of seam rippers. This is actually a surgical style seam ripper. Very dangerous. You want to keep this put up safe. You can change the blade on it, which is nice because it's not disposable. You can always just change the blade if it starts getting dull, but you can very easily, it's got a very sharp curved point, get in to remove stitching. If you need to shave a little bit of stitching off, maybe you had a bird's nest as you were stitching a little jumble of fabric, you can easily use that just to shave the threads off. And it's a really nice tool to keep on hand, but again, be really careful with it. Now to go along with all of your cutting tools, I like to have a few different types of rulers. You always have to have a 24-inch by 6 or 6.5-inch ruler. That's kind of what you always use when you're cutting across the width of your bolts of fabric. Really handy to have on hand. But it's also nice to have some narrower rulers. If you need to cut just 1/4 of an inch off of something, if you're skimming 1/4 of an inch, or if you're paper piecing and cutting 1/4 of an inch from your seam, this is a nice ruler to have on hand. You can use it for marking, but you can also use it for cutting with. I always like having a little square up ruler too, something that's around 6 inches so I can square up blocks that I'm working on. This one has a diagonal line, so if I have triangle units, I can put that diagonal line right on the angle of my triangle as I square up, really handy. This actually comes with a little yellow triangle that you can position for different sizes of triangles for cutting too. And then a couple of other sizes of rulers are nice to have on hand. There are 6-inch rulers, 8-inch rulers, 14 inches wide, and depending on the project that you're working on, it's nice to have some different widths of shorter rulers. So if you're working with a smaller cutting mat or in a smaller area or just trying to cut out squares, sometimes it's nice to have a little bit shorter ruler so you're not trying to maneuver around with the big 24-inch standard cutting ruler. So as you're working on becoming a more advanced quilter, you'll find that you'll probably be picking up lots of different little sewing gadgets, different types of rulers, different types of cutters, and you'll really enjoy working with them. They'll make the job faster and easier. Just make sure you take good care of all of your cutting tools, make sure they're labeled that they're yours for fabric, and keep them away from little children, so keep them somewhere safe in your sewing room. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson all about cutting tools. We'll see you next time.
This episode of My First Quilt has been brought to you by Baby Lock, for the love of sewing, OmniGrid, providing quilters with specialty rulers and accessories for over 30 years. Furniture provided by Koala, fine sewing furniture custom built for you.